Hello everyone and welcome to a GCSE History Revision tutorial that's going to be useful for Paper 2 on the superpower relations and the Cold War unit. And this video is going to focus on détente in the 1970s. As we work through the video, you can either pause the presentation to just take down notes from the slides or listen to the commentary as we work through. As we work through the content, bear in mind the questions that we could face on this material. The questions can be of three types: consequence, narrative, and importance questions. And there are separate presentations on the CHSG History channel about how to tackle each of those. Let's place the period of détente in context to see where it fits in the Cold War. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the edge of a nuclear confrontation between the superpowers. Both were desperate to avoid the possibility of this happening again. And in the late 1960s, America in particular was beset by social problems linked to the Vietnam War. Popular protests had sprung up against government policies, and people were demanding change. And this fed into the political decisions that were made. And by the late 1960s, technology was also moving forward. Anti-ballistic missiles, those are missiles which could destroy incoming missiles, had undermined MAD theory, the theory of mutually assured destruction. And these were making the world a more dangerous place. So all of these factors combined served to make détente a more likely development. Let's look at the leaders who are in power throughout the period of détente. For the Soviet Union, this is a really easy thing to remember. There was only one leader all the way through this period, and that's Leonid Brezhnev. On the American side, it's slightly more complicated. We've got three presidents to try to remember. So the period of détente is started by Richard Nixon, who was president until 1974. And then from 74 to 77, the American president was Gerald Ford, who continued the détente process. And then from 1977 onwards, to the end of détente and slightly beyond, the president was Jimmy Carter. And Carter continued détente, but also brought it to a close at the end of 1979. If you look at our images, you can see Brezhnev meeting each of those presidents. Let's look at the superpowers' motives for détente to see what they both wanted out of better relations. What they had in common was a desire to avoid nuclear confrontation, a desire to ensure that mutually assured destruction applied to the opposing power as much as themselves. But both also had their own reasons for wanting an easing of tensions. Brezhnev was desperate to try to improve living standards in the Soviet Union. And he wanted to divert resources towards that, as opposed to spending money in the nuclear arms race. And he also knew that if he could get on better with the West, he could get access to Western technology to speed up improvements in the standard of living. And this was also a good moment for the Soviet Union to call a halt to the arms race, because by the end of the 1960s, it had pretty much achieved parity, equality with the United States. So this would be a good point for the Soviet Union to put a pause on that spending. Similarly, Nixon also wanted to reduce military expenditure. He also wanted to focus more on the domestic issues around the Vietnam War and civil rights protests that he faced. Now, from the mid-1960s onwards, America had become embroiled in the Vietnam War. This was a disastrous war, unpopular at home and disastrous diplomatically abroad. And part of Nixon's promise at election was that he would be able to remove America from the Vietnam War. And he hoped if he could get on better with the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union would give him political assistance with their communist allies in Vietnam to bring the war to a close. So the easing of tension has several features, and these features run throughout the decade of détente. So the world saw sharing of technology. The high point of this was a shared space mission. Also increasing trade between the superpowers, and that was particularly beneficial to the Soviet Union. A focus on arms control and all the various categories of nuclear weapons. Reciprocal visits and talks between the leaders, with visits to each other's capitals. And probably most importantly, a series of international agreements. And it's those agreements that we're going to really focus on. The first agreement we'll look at is the SALT I Treaty of 1972. Diplomatic conditions have been improving throughout this year, which made the signing of this treaty possible. So East and West Germany had signed the basic treaty, which meant that there was less tension around Germany. And secondly, Richard Nixon had visited China as part of a drive for better relations between America and China. And this gave a real impetus for the Soviet Union to come to terms with America too. It's worth remembering at this point that the SALT talks, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, have been going on for years previous to 1972. This isn't a quick process, it's one that had been going on for years. So let's look at what the treaty contained. There are three key aspects to SALT I. Firstly, an anti-ballistic missile treaty. The treaty said that both sides could only protect two cities or two sites with anti-ballistic missiles. This is important because it reinforces MAD. Secondly, limits were placed on the number of missiles that the superpowers could have, with the Soviet Union being allowed slightly more intercontinental ballistic missiles, which represented the fact that America had more strategic bombers. So it doesn't look fair, but it does work out. There's also an agreement to limit SLBMs, nuclear missiles based at sea, and they were limited to 740 each. So the numbers are still very high, but there is at least a freezing, there's at least a limit. And thirdly, the Basic Principles Agreement, which outlined the rules of nuclear warfare and the extent to where nuclear weapons could be placed and how nuclear warfare would be conducted. The Cold War unit of work focuses on consequences in its questions a lot and importance. So let's spend a few moments analysing the importance of SALT 1. The treaty increased security by reinforcing mutually assured destruction. It went further than previous treaties had, with the superpowers agreeing limitations on their nuclear arsenals. It built trust between the two sides, and it showed the leaders that both sides, their opponents, would negotiate and there was a point to talking. So after the treaty was signed, the SALT talks continued and led to a further treaty that we'll look at. And it also served to build relationships between leaders. And you can see Nixon and Brezhnev enjoying a conversation over a drink there. So this led to reciprocal visits and strengthening of diplomacy. But if we look for limitations of SALT 1, the treaty only covered missiles. It didn't cover warheads. So both superpowers continued to stockpile these after the treaty was signed. And the treaty also didn't address MIRVs. These are multiple independent nuclear weapons. A nuclear weapon that can split into multiple smaller warheads. The treaty didn't mention this new technology. So in some ways, it was already obsolete when it was signed. The next agreements we'll look at are the Helsinki Accords of 1975. The Helsinki Accords were a wide-ranging set of agreements signed by the superpowers and also 33 other nations, including all NATO powers and all Warsaw Pact powers. The Accords were set out into three baskets involving European borders, international cooperation and human rights. We'll have a look at each of these in turn. So the first basket addressed European borders. And the declaration stated that all borders within Europe were permanent and could not be changed by force. Now that has real political significance because it recognised and formalised the division of East and West Germany, and that's not something that America had done or agreed to before this. And secondly, it recognised all borders within Eastern Europe for the Soviet satellite states, so it confirmed the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. So this basket was a real win for Brezhnev, because Eastern European security had been a priority of Soviet policy since the Second World War. And this is an area where Ford had had to make a trade, and he was criticised at home by a range of politicians for being too generous in agreeing to this, because it confirmed Soviet domination. The second basket of agreements addressed international cooperation, and they stated that countries would work together for better relations, including trade agreements and exchanges in technology. And the technological cooperation peaked with the Apollo-Soyuz space mission, in which American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts joined up in space. And that was a highly symbolic moment of unity. And this basket again is a big win for Brezhnev, because he hoped to use the superior technology of the West to quickly raise living standards in the Soviet Union. And again, this is an area where Ford had to take a hit, America was ahead in this area, and it was agreeing to share its advantage. And again, he was criticised for being too generous in giving away too much of America's superiority and helping the Soviet leaders too much. The third basket addressed human rights. And it stated that human rights and freedoms, such as free speech, freedom of religion and free movement, would be allowed across Europe. And this again has political significance, particularly because these were things that the Soviet Union had not allowed in their satellite states. And the Brezhnev doctrine had stated that conformity was important above all other things. So in this, Brezhnev has taken a hit. And he was concerned that human rights organisations would be more active in the Soviet satellite states. The basket stated that these would be allowed. But he was well aware that it would be very hard for the West to enforce these changes. So this was an agreement he was prepared to make, particularly to get his hands on American technology and more secure borders. So finally, this is an area that Ford had gained in, and he hoped to undermine Soviet control in Eastern Europe through human rights concerns. By allowing more protest, he hoped that the Soviet grip on these countries would be weakened. Let's have a quick look at some interpretation about the Helsinki Accords. We'll have a look at the work here of John Lewis Gaddis, an American historian who has written extensively on the Cold War. Just pause the presentation briefly and have a read through of his thoughts about the impact on Brezhnev and Ford, and then press play when you're ready to restart. So Gaddis believed that Helsinki had really damaged Brezhnev in the long term. That the human rights basket had real significance with protest movements in later years and decades. And so this had been a real cost that Brezhnev had incurred. Whereas the cost for America and Ford in particular was much more obvious in the short term. The Helsinki Accords were criticised at home, particularly because he seemed to be allowing Soviet domination in Eastern Europe. And this was a big factor in him losing the election that he faced with Jimmy Carter. Let's look next at the SALT II Agreement of 1979. The SALT talks had continued after SALT I, and by 1979, both sides were ready to agree another treaty. And further reductions and real reductions in nuclear arsenals were agreed. But this treaty coincided with the end of Détente just months later. Relations were worsening. So SALT II was not ratified. So it wasn't formally signed off by either government. But it still matters because both sides agreed to honour the terms that they had agreed. And here's what they agreed. Absolute equality in the number of missiles that they had, and that included MIRVs this time. A testing ban on new programs, and the interim treaty of SALT I was formalised, and the strategic limitations of how a nuclear war would be fought were made permanent. Here are some of the consequences of SALT II, why it's an important treaty. So firstly, it lasted. It was honoured until it expired in 1985. It secured reductions in nuclear arsenals, and it included MIRVs, which had not been controlled by SORT 1. But it did have limitations. So both sides continued to research and begin new programs to increase their nuclear capabilities. So for example, America continued and maintained a cruise missile program, and also began a strategic defense initiative, a Star Wars program, in 1983 under Ronald Reagan. Let's look at how Détente came to an end. So months after SALT II had been agreed, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and this was quickly followed by the election of Ronald Reagan as president, who was more hardline than Jimmy Carter and had no interest in reviving the process of an easing of tensions. Let's look at how Détente came to an end. Firstly, America had become increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress around human rights, that the agreements of Helsinki had not resulted in improvements. President Carter was increasingly influenced by his security advisor, Brezhnev, who advised him to take a harsher line with the Soviets. And secondly, America had been humiliated in the Iran hostage crisis, and during the Iranian Revolution, American citizens had been taken hostage for over a year, and America had been unable to secure their release. This had been an international humiliation. So when the Soviets launched an invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979, Carter was more than ready to end at this period of easing of tensions. Here's our key point. The USA government wanted to take a tougher stance internationally to bring about more impact on the USSR's behaviour, but also to limit the criticisms that they faced at home. Détente had become an unpopular policy, and this was cemented by Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. You could take this further with some practice questions. So here is a consequence question, a narrative question, and an importance question. The narrative question does come from a past paper. There's advice on how to do each of these questions in other presentations on the CHSG History channel. Okay, thanks for watching. Remember, there's lots of other videos and presentations for you to have a look at on the CHSG History channel.